The wind never stopped blowing through Silver Creek. It carried dust, gossip, and fear in equal measure. Every porchboard creaked like it had secrets to tell, and every man in town watched the horizon as if expecting ghosts to ride out of it. The year was 1873, and the truce between settlers and the Apache Nation was thinner than a rattlesnake's skin. For months, raids had left ranches in ruins. Cattle vanished. Wagons burned. Each side blamed the other. The settlers said the Apaches were bloodthirsty savages. The Apaches claimed it was revenge for their stolen lands and murdered kin. Between them stood Sheriff Amos Weller, a man who measured peace in coin and convenience. When the Apache chief, Greyhawk, sent a message offering a peace treaty, the sheriff saw an opportunity, not for justice but for reputation. He wanted the governor's praise and the town's trust, and if he could end the raids with one public gesture, all the better. But the chief's condition was strange. A union between his people and the settlers, one that would show true intention, not just empty words. So the sheriff gathered the townsfolk in front of the old church. The air was thick with dust and dread. Men muttered about savagery. Women clutched their shawls and whispered prayers. On the steps stood Clara Whitmore, 19 years old, pale as the winter moon. Clara had not volunteered. Her father had. "Peace needs sacrifice," Sheriff Weller declared, his voice echoing against the church's whitewashed boards. "And the Whitmore family understands what must be done for the good of Silver Creek." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder, heavy, trembling. He was a man broken by debt, his ranch near ruin, his reputation tattered after a scandal involving stolen cattle. Selling his daughter's hand wasn't justice. It was survival. She wanted to speak, to refuse, to scream that she'd rather die than marry a man she'd never met, a man the town called an enemy. But her father's whisper stopped her. "Do it, Clara," he said softly, eyes downcast. "For me." The crowd parted as a line of Apache riders approached, silent and proud. At their head rode Talon, the chief's second son. He was tall, bare-shouldered, with long black hair bound in a strip of leather. His gaze swept over the townspeople, the sneers, the fear, the hate, and came to rest on Clara. He dismounted with the grace of a hawk landing, his boots stirring the dust at her feet. For a long, unbearable moment, no one spoke. "This is the woman?" he asked in rough but steady English. Sheriff Weller nodded quickly. "Yes, Clara Whitmore, daughter of the finest rancher in Silver Creek." Clara wanted to laugh at the lie. Her father wasn't fine. He was desperate. Talon's dark eyes met hers again. There was no mockery in them, no hunger, only something distant, like he was weighing her soul rather than her face. Then he nodded once and said, "It will be done." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The minister, pale and shaking, stumbled through the vows in a mixture of English and Apache. Clara's voice barely carried when she repeated the words. The ring wasn't gold, but a strip of braided horsehair. When Talon tied it around her finger, she felt the world tilt. When the ceremony ended, Sheriff Weller stepped forward, grinning for the crowd. There, a new dawn for Silver Creek. The bloodshed ends tonight, but the people didn't cheer. They only watched, some with pity, some with disgust, as Talon led Clara toward his waiting horse. She didn't look back. The town that had raised her, that had laughed at her for being plain and quiet, now watched her walk into the desert like an offering to the gods. The wind rose again, howling between the buildings. Somewhere behind her, someone spat and muttered, "Ain't right." "Giving our women to savages." Clara swallowed hard, her throat burning with dust and shame. She didn't know what awaited her beyond those red cliffs, whether it was freedom or a slower kind of death. But as Silver Creek faded behind her, she made a silent promise. If this marriage was a bargain for peace, then peace would come at a price, one the town would never forget. The morning after the wedding, Clara Whitmore awoke to the sound of silence. Not the quiet she'd known in her room above the Whitmore ranch. This was deeper, alive with the pulse of the desert. The air was cold, the kind that stings the lungs and smells of dust and sage. When she opened her eyes, she saw endless red earth and a sky painted gold by dawn. Her old life was gone. She sat upright on the blanket laid beside a dying fire. The Apache camp was still. Men were tending horses, sharpening knives, and cooking over coals. Women wrapped in deer hides moved quietly between them, their faces unreadable. No one looked at her long enough to be cruel. No one spoke to her at all. Only Talon stood apart, her husband. He was a striking figure, tall and still as stone, his hair black as a raven's wing. He wore a necklace of carved bone and turquoise, and his expression was calm, distant. When his eyes met hers, she felt the same sharp jolt she had felt at the church. It wasn't attraction. It was awareness, and of a man who saw her stripped of pity or judgment. She hated that. When he approached, Clara stiffened. Her hands gripped the blanket as if it were armor. "You ride with me," he said simply, pointing toward a dark horse tethered nearby. His English was careful, each word deliberate. "I can ride on my own," she answered quickly, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound steady. He looked at her a moment, then nodded once. "Then ride." They left the camp together, though they didn't ride side by side. The trail wound through dry canyons and sun-baked plateaus. Crows circled high above. Clara's back ached, her throat parched, but she refused to ask for water. Pride was all she had left. That, and anger. At midday, Talon halted beside a narrow stream that glimmered faintly in the light. He dismounted and gestured for her to drink. Clara ignored him, pretending not to see. He didn't insist. Instead, he knelt, cupped water in his hands, and let it spill over his head, cooling his face. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. "You hate me?" he said. She flinched. "You took me away from my home. What did you expect?" He looked up at her, unoffended. "I took no one. Your people gave you." His words cut sharper than any insult. Clara wanted to shout that he was wrong, that she hadn't been given, she'd been sold. But the truth sat heavy in her chest, too bitter to deny. They traveled for hours more before reaching the Apache village, a cluster of huts made from branches and hides, resting beneath towering red cliffs. Smoke rose from small fires. Children ran barefoot, their laughter echoing across the canyon walls. It wasn't what Clara expected. There was no savagery, no chaos, only rhythm, a way of life older than her town itself. Talon dismounted first, motioning for her to follow. "This," he said, "is your home now." She wanted to tell him it never would be. That her heart belonged to Silver Creek, no matter how cruel it had been. But as she looked around, she realized the truth. Silver Creek had never been her home either. It had only ever been a place where she was expected to obey, smile, and disappear. That night, she sat by the fire outside the hut Talon had built for her, a small circle of stones, lined with woven mats. He brought her food, roasted corn and meat she couldn't name, and placed it silently before her. "She didn't touch it. Eat," he said. "You will need strength." "I'm not hungry." He studied her for a moment, then nodded again. "As you wish." He turned away and left her alone under the stars. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, staring into the flames. The desert night grew colder, darker. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't spoken cruelly. He had treated her in his quiet, steady way, with a kind of respect she didn't understand. And that unsettled her most of all because it meant that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about who her enemy was. The first week in the Apache village was the longest of Clara's life. Every morning began before sunrise with the sound of hooves, drums, and the distant cries of hawks cutting through the dawn. The air was dry as bone, the earth a palette of rust and gold. The cliffs around her seemed to breathe, changing color with the light from deep crimson to pale rose, as though alive and watching her. Clara was a stranger in every way. The Apache language flowed like music she couldn't follow. Their customs, their silences, their way of looking at the world, all of it left her feeling adrift. She spent her days alone, fetching water, cleaning her small hut, or sitting near the fire pit pretending not to notice when the Apache women glanced her way. They didn't hate her, not openly. They were simply wary, the way wild horses eye a newcomer before deciding if it's threat or kin. Talon rarely spoke to her. He came and went like a shadow. In the mornings, he would ride off with the warriors, and by nightfall he would return with game or herbs, sometimes a pouch of dried berries. He always left some near her door. She never said thank you. She didn't know how, but what surprised her most was that he never entered her hut. Not once. One evening, Clara watched from a distance as Talon helped a young boy learn to draw a bow. His patience startled her. When the child missed the mark, Talon didn't scold. He smiled faintly, adjusted the boy's stance, and tried again. There was gentleness in his movements, a steadiness that reminded her of her late mother, who used to hum as she mended torn dresses on the ranch porch. That night, as the campfire painted his face in shades of bronze and gold, Clara asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why did you agree to marry me?" He looked up from sharpening his knife. The crackling fire filled the long pause between them. "My father wanted peace," he said finally. "The white men wanted proof," she frowned. "And you? What did you want?" His gaze held hers, calm, dark, unreadable. "I wanted to keep my people alive." It wasn't the answer she expected, and for a moment she felt foolish for asking. She wanted to tell him about Silver Creek, how they'd called her the peace offering, how the sheriff had smiled like he'd done something noble. But she couldn't form the words. Somehow sharing her shame with him felt like giving it power. Over the next few days, something in her began to shift. The work that once felt like punishment slowly became rhythm. Fetching water meant walking beneath vast cliffs where eagles soared and wind whispered secrets through the stones. Gathering wood became a quiet ritual, a way to feel useful. One afternoon she followed an older woman named Atsa to the canyon ridge to gather herbs. Atsa spoke little English, but her kindness bridged the gap. She showed Clara how to find the tiny green leaves that grew between rocks. "Healing plants," she said, "for fever and wounds." For the first time, Clara laughed when she stumbled, and Atsa laughed too. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was a beginning. That evening, Talon returned with a wild rabbit. When she saw him skin it with swift, practiced hands, she found herself saying softly, "I can cook it." He raised a brow, surprised, then handed it to her without a word. She roasted it over the fire with salt from her pouch and shared it between them. When he took the first bite, he nodded. "Good." It was only one word, but it carried the weight of peace. Not the kind signed with papers or blood, but the kind that grows from silence slowly, like spring grass after rain. That night, under the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, Clara lay awake in her hut, listening to the quiet hum of the desert. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid. The world beyond Silver Creek, the one she had been taught to fear, was not cruel. It was vast, wild, and alive, and maybe, just maybe, she could belong in it. By the second moon of her life among the Apache, Clara Whitmore was no longer the helpless girl who had been dragged from Silver Creek in tears. Her hands had toughened, her skin browned from the relentless sun, and her spirit, once bound in fear, began to wake like a caged bird testing its wings. At first, the Apache women had watched her with silent judgment. When she stumbled while grinding maize or spilled water from the clay jar, they turned away, hiding their amusement behind polite indifference. Clara endured it without complaint. Every night when the others slept, she practiced. She carried heavier loads, walked farther, and repeated each task until her muscles burned. She refused to be the town's pity or the tribe's burden, Talon noticed. He said little, but his gaze followed her in quiet approval. One evening, as she struggled to lift a heavy bundle of firewood, he stepped forward to help. "I can manage," she snapped, breathless but determined. He studied her for a long moment before stepping back. Then manage. And she did, though her arms trembled for hours afterward. That night she overheard him speaking with Atsa, the elder woman who had taken a liking to her. "She fights everything," Atsa said, half amused, half proud. "She fights herself," Talon replied. "When she stops, she will be strong." Clara pretended not to hear, but his words burned in her chest long after the fire had died. The desert was teaching her things no book ever had. She learned how to read the wind, how to sense a storm before it came, how to tell when a rattlesnake was near by the rhythm of the sand. When the tribe's children laughed at her awkward accent while repeating Apache words, she didn't scold. She laughed with them. Slowly, their giggles softened into respect. Still, some resisted her presence. One man, a scarred warrior named Chano, often sneered when she passed. "White woman brings trouble," he muttered one night near the fire. "First we take her, next the soldiers come." Clara had been mending a torn blanket, pretending not to listen, but the sting of his words drew blood. Before she could think better of it, she rose to her feet. "If your peace depends on hating me," she said clearly, "then your peace is as weak as my town's promises." The camp went silent. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. Talon's eyes met hers across the flames, not angry, not warning, but alive with something fierce and proud. Chano's lips curled. You have spirit for a woman sold like cattle. Clara's voice didn't waver. Maybe cattle can still kick. Laughter rippled through the camp, breaking the tension. Even Chano grunted and turned away. From that night on, no one called her a burden again. Days turned to weeks, and with each sunrise she found herself less the outsider and more the student of a land that demanded respect. One morning, Talon brought her to a high ridge overlooking the valley. The canyon below blazed with wildflowers, reds and golds clinging stubbornly to stone. You see? He said quietly. Even in a place made of death, something lives. Clara followed his gaze. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. It's beautiful, she murmured. And cruel, he nodded. Like truth. They stood there a long while, saying nothing more. But something passed between them, not romance, not yet, but recognition. Two people forged by loss, learning that survival was not the same as living. That night, as the drums of a distant dance echoed across the canyon, Clara sat alone by her hut, staring into the stars. She thought of Silver Creek, of her father's trembling hand on her shoulder, of Sheriff Weller's smug smile, of the way no one had stopped the marriage. The memory no longer hollowed her out. It hardened her resolve. If she had been traded away like a thing, she would become something no one could own. Not the sheriff, not her father, not even Talon. But when she looked toward Talon's fire across the clearing, where he sat sharpening his blade beneath the moonlight, she couldn't help wondering if he already knew that. Because sometimes, she caught him looking at her the same way she now looked at herself, as though she were something untamed, something worth fighting for. The summer sun hung heavy over the canyon, baking the world in heat and silence. The days had settled into rhythm, hunting, cooking, gathering, surviving. For the first time, Clara Whitmore felt her mind clear enough to notice the peace between breaths. But peace, she soon learned, was fragile. It cracked under truth. It began one evening when she returned early from the river with Atsa. As they approached the camp, voices drifted from Talon's lodge, low, urgent tones. They spoke in Apache, but certain English words slipped through like stones breaking the surface of still water. Guns. Gold. Sheriff. Clara froze. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She had never heard Talon sound angry, but now his voice was edged with restrained fury. When the men left, she waited a moment before entering. Talon was sitting cross-legged by the fire pit, his jaw set, eyes dark as storm clouds. What did they want? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. Talon, she pressed, stepping closer. I heard. He cut her off. You heard what you were not meant to hear, she bristled. You think because I'm not one of you I can't understand what's happening. I have a right to know if this piece is a lie. His gaze snapped up, sharp as flint. It is your people's lie, he said, voice low but steady. Not mine. Clara stared, her anger faltering. What do you mean? He turned toward the fire, the light painting the scars along his shoulder. Silver Creek sends weapons, rifles, powder turned into the Comancheros. They sell death, then blame the Apache. The sheriff takes gold for each wagon that burns. When my people strike back, he calls it savagery, and now the governor calls him a hero for marrying you into peace. The room seemed to tilt around her. She felt dizzy, cold. No, that can't be true. Talon's voice softened, but it carried the weight of certainty. I wish it were not. Clara sank to her knees beside the fire. Images flashed in her mind. Her father's trembling hands, Sheriff Weller's easy smile, the way the town had cheered when the deal was struck. Her stomach turned. She had been the price of their deceit, a pawn traded to silence the truth. For the first time since coming to the Apache, she wept. Not out of fear or humiliation, but rage. Talon didn't move closer, didn't comfort her. He only said quietly, Now you see why I fight. Not for revenge, for justice that does not hide behind pretty words. She looked up at him through tears. And my father? Did he know? Talon hesitated, then nodded once. He knew. The word hit like a bullet. Clara pressed a hand to her chest as if to hold her heart in place. Her father, the man who told her it was for peace, who said it would save their family, had known it was a lie all along. He hadn't saved her. He'd sold her. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat outside her hut beneath a sky full of indifferent stars, the desert wind cold against her face. The truth had stripped her bare. Every comfort, every loyalty she'd clung to from Silver Creek, now turned to ash. But beneath the pain was something else. A spark of clarity. She had spent her life obeying men who hid behind power. Her father, the sheriff, the governor. They'd built peace on the backs of others and called it righteousness. Not anymore. In the morning, when Talon prepared his horse for patrol, she stood before him. Her eyes were swollen but fierce. "If they betrayed you," she said, "they betrayed me too. I won't hide from that." He looked at her for a long time, searching her face as though seeing her for the first time. Then quietly he handed her a bow. Small, light, made for training. "Then learn," he said. "A heart that knows truth must also know how to fight for it." And for the first time, Clara took the weapon, not as a captive, not as a wife, but as someone awakening to her own power. The full moon rose over the canyon like a silver coin, illuminating the rugged cliffs and the winding river below. The camp was quiet, save for the soft crackle of fires and the distant calls of owls. But that night was different. Clara felt it in the air, a tension that hummed like a bowstring pulled taut. Talon approached her hut at dusk. His expression was unreadable, as always, but the set of his shoulders carried purpose. He didn't speak at first, only gestured for her to follow. Clara, curiosity overcoming caution, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked beside him in silence. They traveled through narrow canyons and across rocky mesas until the world opened into a hidden valley she hadn't known existed. Here the earth was softer, dotted with wildflowers that seemed to bloom against the red stone like defiance. And there in the moonlight stood a magnificent stallion, coat gleaming like spun silver, mane and tail flowing in the soft night breeze. Clara froze. She had never seen a horse like this, powerful, proud, untamed, yet obedient. The animal's eyes, dark and intelligent, met hers, and in that gaze she felt a strange, unspoken understanding. Talon dismounted and stepped forward. "I captured him weeks ago," he said. "I tamed him for you." "For me?" she asked, her voice catching. "Yes," he replied simply. "Not as a gift for the town, not as a show of power. For you, to honor you." Clara blinked. The words settled slowly, like sunlight piercing a cloud. She remembered the jeers from Silver Creek, the whispered curses about her being sold to a savage. She remembered the shame, the fear, the helplessness. And now here was Talon, her husband, a man she barely understood, standing beside her with a gift so extraordinary it silenced every doubt she had ever held. She stepped closer to the stallion, hand trembling. He nickered softly, lowering his head to meet her touch. The animal radiated strength, trust, and freedom. Everything she had felt stolen from her at the church steps in Silver Creek. Talon's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "This horse is yours, Clara. To ride, to guide, to protect yourself. It is a symbol. They may have taken your freedom in name, but not your spirit, not your choice." Clara's eyes welled with tears. She had never been honored like this, never recognized, never respected. Her town had celebrated a hollow peace, but Talon's gesture carried weight, history, and intention. It was a gift that spoke of loyalty, courage, and love. Not the forced kind, but the kind that grows silently, patiently, through trust. She mounted the stallion slowly, feeling the power beneath her. The creature shifted, muscles coiling like springs, and then, as if sensing her will, moved gracefully into a trot. Clara felt the wind against her face, the thrum of life beneath her, and something within her lifted, hope, strength, a sense of belonging she had never known. Talon followed on his own horse, watching her, not controlling her. She could hear his pride without him speaking. The hidden valley stretched endlessly before them, and for the first time Clara understood freedom, not as escape, but as recognition. When they returned to camp, she dismounted, hands still shaking. Talon looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You understand now," he said, "that you are not a token. You are not a bargaining chip. You are your own." Clara nodded, words failing her. She glanced back at the silver stallion, who nickered softly as if affirming the truth. The gift would not only honor her, it would silence the town. For Silver Creek had believed they could trade, sell, or humiliate her. But here was proof that the Apache saw her value, that her worth was more than their judgments. And in the quiet of the canyon, under the watchful moon, Clara felt it. The first spark of belonging, The first taste of power, the first stirrings of love, not forced, not bought but earned in trust, respect, and courage. Silver Creek had never looked smaller to Clara. From the ridge above the town, she could see the sun reflecting off the roofs of the scattered wooden buildings, hear the distant clatter of horse hooves on dirt streets, and smell the faint tang of smoke rising from chimneys. But this time she was not returning as a frightened girl. She was coming back armed with truth, and beside her rode Talon, tall, silent, and impossibly commanding on his horse. The townsfolk spotted them almost immediately. Women clutched their shawls, children hid behind their mothers, and the men straightened, unsure whether to stand proudly or shrink from the confrontation they had ignored for months. Whispers spread like wildfire. The girl and the Apache. They're back? Clara felt a pang of something she hadn't expected, a thrill of righteous anger. She remembered every sneer, every whispered insult about her being sold, every glance of pity from the people who called themselves her neighbors. And now she would face them, not as a victim but as a witness to their lies. Talon led his horse down the main street with the measured calm of a predator, the silver stallion beside him gleaming in the sunlight. The townspeople could not look away. Gasps escaped lips, murmurs turned into murmurs of awe, and finally a silence fell, the kind that precedes reckoning. Sheriff Weller stepped forward, trying to mask his fear with an empty bravado. This is a surprise," he said, voice cracking slightly. "We didn't expect you to—" Clara raised her chin. "Expect me to return?" She interrupted, voice steady and clear. "No, but you did expect to hide your crimes behind my father's fear and my obedience. You expected me to be silent. You expected the Apache to remain obedient to lies. You miscalculated." The crowd stiffened, the weight of her words sinking in. Talon dismounted silently. His presence alone was enough to draw attention, but when he stepped forward, the full force of his authority became clear. "Silver Creek," he said, voice calm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. "You have traded lies for gold, deceit for peace, and called it justice. You sent weapons to our enemies and blamed my people for the bloodshed that followed. You forced this woman into a marriage under false pretenses to cover your sins." The murmurs grew into a roar. Some shouted denials. Others turned pale as guilt clawed at their conscience. Clara's father shrank back, avoiding her eyes as if he could melt into the dusty street. Clara did not hesitate. She stepped beside Talon. "Every lie you told," she said, voice rising over the crowd, "every piece of injustice you committed has been exposed. I am not a token. I am not your bargaining chip. And I am not afraid." The sheriff's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth to speak, but Talon raised a hand. Silence returned, absolute and heavy. Then Talon gestured to the silver stallion standing majestic beside them. "This," he said, "is a gift for truth. It is proof that honor and respect are not yours to trade or buy. The woman you called a peace offering is valued beyond your reckoning." The crowd went still, unable to look away. Even the bravest men of Silver Creek felt the shame of their deceit. For the first time, the town realized that Clara had not been stolen, not humbled, not broken. She had been recognized and honored in a way they could never understand. Some wept. Some turned away. Some simply stared, mouths agape. And in the midst of it all, Clara finally saw her own power. Quiet, unyielding, unstoppable. As the sun climbed higher, the town would remember this day not as a wedding, not as a theft, but as a reckoning. The day truth rode in on a silver stallion, and the lies of Silver Creek fell silent at last. The sun beat down on Silver Creek, casting long shadows from the wooden buildings onto the dusty streets. For the first time, the town felt smaller, shrunken under the weight of its own shame. Clara Whitmore and Talon remained in the center of the main street, silent but unyielding, as the townsfolk processed the truth that had shattered their fragile pride. The sheriff, usually a figure of unquestioned authority, stood frozen. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his hands shaking as if he might drop the law he had used to manipulate the town for so long. Clara's father shrank into the corner of the street, eyes averted, lips pressed in a thin line of guilt. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. Her voice rang clear and unwavering, carrying the strength of weeks spent learning survival, respect, and self-worth. "You wanted peace," she said, addressing the crowd. "But you built it on lies. You forced me into a marriage you called necessary, but it was nothing but cover for your greed. And yet here I stand, alive, unbroken, honored, and free." A low murmur spread through the crowd. Some whispered apologies. Some shook their heads in disbelief. The townsfolk could not reconcile the girl they had pitied with the woman who now stood tall, her dignity more formidable than any weapon they had wielded. Talon stepped forward beside her, his expression calm but commanding. "Silver Creek," he said, voice carrying across the street. "You have been shown truth. You sent arms to our enemies and blamed us. You forced a child into a marriage to hide your crimes. You called it peace. That peace is nothing without justice." He gestured toward the silver stallion, its coat glinting in the morning sun, mane flowing like liquid moonlight. The horse shifted its weight, powerful and proud, a living symbol of the respect and honor that Clara had earned. Clara felt the heat of the moment in her chest, not shame, not fear, but fierce, righteous pride. The whispers in the crowd fell silent when she spoke again. "You see this horse? It is my gift. A gift from the man I now call my husband. It is not wealth, it is not power, it is not pity. It is honor. And that is something none of you can buy or sell." Some townsfolk turned away, unable to face their complicity. Others bowed their heads, shame overtaking their stubborn pride. Even the sheriff lowered his gaze, realizing that the day of his triumph had ended in disgrace. Clara's father took a tentative step forward, but she held up a hand. "No words from you can undo what you tried to do," she said. "This lesson is for everyone here. Truth cannot be silenced, and no bargain built on lies is worth the cost of another person's dignity." A hush fell over the street. Children peeked from behind doorways, their small eyes wide as they witnessed a lesson in courage that no school or sermon could have taught. Silver Creek had seen its lies stripped bare, and its people could not deny it. Talon placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, steady and protective. "You are your own now," he said. "No one here owns you, and no one can take what is yours." Clara looked out over the town, at the faces of those who had once mocked her, who had whispered that she was a possession to be traded. Now they were silent. Their judgment had been replaced with awe, fear, and the uneasy realization that they had underestimated the girl they thought they could control. The silver stallion shifted beside her, powerful and calm, a reminder of the freedom and respect she had earned. Clara's chest swelled with a quiet triumph. She had been tested, traded, and challenged, but she had emerged unbroken and unafraid. As the sun climbed higher, the dust settled, and for the first time, Silver Creek felt the weight of truth. And Clara knew that nothing, no insult, no betrayal, no town, could ever take from her what she had claimed: her voice, her strength, and her dignity. The canyon winds whispered through the red cliffs as Clara rode the silver stallion along the river's edge, Talon at her side. Months had passed since their return from Silver Creek, and yet the memory of that day, the town's stunned silence, the weight of truth finally revealed, lingered like smoke in her mind. But the battles of words and honor were over. Now there was something quieter, subtler, stirring between them. Something neither had expected. Talon had always been steady, unyielding, a man carved from stone and wind. But in the days that followed, Clara began to notice the little things, the way he adjusted her cloak against the cold desert morning, the way he watched her with quiet pride when she handled the stallion as if it were an extension of herself, the faintest curve of his mouth when she made a clever remark in his limited Apache tongue. Clara, for her part, had changed too. She no longer flinched at his presence. She had learned the rhythm of the land, the language of the wind, and the way to meet his gaze without fear. She could see the man beneath the warrior, the one who carried grief and honor in equal measure, and her heart stirred in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, they made camp beneath a natural arch carved by centuries of wind. Talon built the fire, and Clara laid beside it, watching sparks rise like fireflies into the night sky. "You've grown strong," Talon said, his voice low. "I had to," she replied, her eyes tracing the constellations overhead. "You can't survive out here otherwise." He was silent for a long moment, then said, "Not everyone would have endured." Clara looked at him, her chest tightening. "Maybe I didn't have a choice," she said softly. "But endurance, It teaches you more than fear ever could. Talon's eyes met hers, steady and searching. And what have you learned? Clara hesitated, feeling a strange warmth she didn't know how to name. I've learned that respect matters more than fear, that trust is stronger than control, that... Her voice faltered. She swallowed. That sometimes love comes where you least expect it. For the first time, Talon's defenses seemed to drop. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was gentle, deliberate, intimate. Clara felt the heat of his hand, the warmth of his presence, and something inside her shifted. They sat in silence for hours, listening to the desert night. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, and the stars seemed impossibly close. And slowly, like the first rays of dawn creeping over the canyon, love began to grow between them, quiet, patient, uninvited but undeniable. Clara realized that her fear of Talon, of the unknown, of the life forced upon her, had been replaced by something entirely new: admiration, trust, and a fragile, tentative affection. And Talon, the proud Apache warrior who had once seemed untouchable, began to see her not as a challenge or a possession, but as an equal, someone fierce, intelligent, and courageous. By the next morning, their bond had strengthened in ways neither could deny. Clara rode beside Talon through the canyon, laughter spilling from her lips as the silver stallion galloped, mane flying in the wind. The warrior beside her mirrored, her movement no longer a distant figure but a partner, a companion in a life that had once seemed impossible. As they reached the cliff's edge overlooking the valley, Clara felt the vastness of the land, the freedom of choice, and the power of her own spirit. And she understood that love had indeed come uninvited, not forced, not bargained, not expected. And yet it fit seamlessly into her life, growing alongside trust, honor, and respect. Talon glanced at her, his dark eyes soft. "You are mine," he said, not as a claim of ownership, but as a statement of truth. Clara met his gaze and smiled, a mixture of defiance and surrender. "And I am yours," she whispered, "if we choose it together." For the first time she felt the full weight of freedom and love intertwined, and the canyon echoed their unspoken promise, a promise neither fear, nor shame, nor Silver Creek could ever break. Years passed, and Silver Creek slowly recovered from its own shame. The town streets remained dusty, the clapboard buildings weathered, but the memory of Clara Whitmore and Talon, and the silver stallion that had silenced the town, became legend. Travelers who passed through spoke in hushed tones, sharing the story of the girl who had been traded for peace, and the Apache warrior who had honored her in a way the town never could. Clara and Talon returned often to the hidden canyon lands, where the red cliffs and winding rivers offered a freedom that Silver Creek never could. Their home was a blend of two worlds, the traditions of the Apache and the resilience Clara had carried from her upbringing. Children ran barefoot across the valley, their laughter echoing against the cliffs, bridging cultures and bloodlines. But it wasn't just a tale of peace or survival. It was a tale of truth, courage, and unbreakable bonds. When townsfolk spoke of the silver stallion, they remembered it not just as a magnificent animal, but as a symbol that honor and love cannot be bought, and that respect, real respect, is earned, not demanded. Even the older men who had doubted Talon's intentions nodded quietly when travelers mentioned him, the pride in his character undeniable. Clara herself became a quiet legend. She was remembered as the girl who refused to be silenced, who stood tall in the face of betrayal, and who chose courage over fear. Mothers would tell their daughters, "Be brave like Clara," and young men whispered, "Respect her, for she is stronger than any man who thinks he owns her." Talon remained a proud warrior, but he had grown too, not just in skill, but in patience and understanding. He and Clara shared glances across campfires and riding trails that spoke of love deeper than words could convey, a love earned in struggle and trust. One spring, when the canyon flowers bloomed in wild defiance against the red stone, Travelers passing through Silver Creek reported seeing a sight that would live in stories for decades. A girl on a silver stallion, riding alongside a tall, proud Apache warrior, their children laughing at their heels, freedom in every movement. And Silver Creek remembered, not with pride, but with reverence. They remembered the day their lies were exposed, the day the truth silenced every whisper of deceit, and the day a wedding gift, simple in form but monumental in meaning, spoke louder than law or fear. Years later, when Clara and Talon's children rode through the valley, following the paths their parents had carved, the elders of the Apache and the surviving settlers alike watched silently, nodding in understanding. The land had witnessed what the town could not fully grasp at the time, that respect, courage, and honor transcend bloodlines, borders, and old grievances. Clara often sat atop the silver stallion in the fading light, watching her children chase hawks across the cliffs, listening to the river sing, and remembering the girl who had arrived in these lands full of fear and shame. She smiled, finally, free from the burdens imposed by others, finally in love by choice, finally at home in the wild and vast world she had once been forced to leave. Talon's hand found hers, and they shared a quiet moment beneath the fading sun. The canyon echoed with the memory of triumph, love, and survival, and as travelers would tell the story for generations, the legend of Silver Creek endured. A girl, forced into marriage, a warrior who honored her, a silver stallion that spoke louder than words, and the truth that no town, no betrayal, and no fear could ever silence courage, love, or freedom. The story ends with the full circle of justice, love, and legacy, showing that Clara and Talon's bond, born from hardship, became timeless, inspiring all who heard their tale.